everybody. In this video then I'd like to talk over the 2013 Beatrice Garland poem Kamikaze. First then a few brief background notes and then we'll continue. So the poet was born in 1938 in England, worked in medicine and wrote part-time really later in her life from 1989 onwards. And this poem from 2013 was, as it states here, from her first published collection, so very much a late developer in that regard. Now a few other little points. The speaker in this poem is quite a complex thing. It seems to be the daughter of a failed kamikaze pilot. Now, what she is doing in this poem is imagining what it must have been like for him on what should have been his one and only mission. And so therefore the layer of voices in this poem is actually relatively complex, because you have the poet imagining the speaker, i.e. this daughter, imagining her father, the kamikaze pilot. It's a little bit like in Ozymandias, where you have Shelley, I met a traveller, then you have the voice of the traveller, from Anansi Clan, who said, and then he tells his story, and then finally in the middle of the poem you have that couplet which is the inscription on the statue, which represents Ozymandias' voice. So it's a similar idea where you have voices nested one inside the other. One other thing that's worth noting is that this poem uses what we call graphology, which is to say not the words that are written, but the style in which they're written. Graphology is the literary term meaning font. So different graphology with sections in italics, i.e. the slant, denoting her own perspective, and most of the poem written in what we would call standard Roman type, which is to say ordinary upright writing, showing where she is imagining his experiences. Now a quick note on what we mean by kamikaze. Well, kamikaze comes from an old Japanese word, which really means divine wind. Now, this originally, this is a historical name for something. It refers to a supposedly real event in the year 1274, where a Mongol invasion fleet was destroyed by a typhoon, a great storm which saved Japan, and hence the wind of this typhoon was believed to have been divine, it had been sent to save the country. And so this name was then later reused or recycled to refer to these special Air Force suicide units that were formed when World War II turned against Japan in 1944 to 45, when they were losing the war. And the objective was that the pilots were expected to crash planes loaded with explosive and bombs into American warships to cause maximum damage. Essentially, they were in such a bad position, they had so few bombs that they literally couldn't afford to waste them, whereas what they did have was a surplus of manpower, so they decided it would be better to, for it to literally be an equation of one man, one ship. And as you can imagine, it spread a great deal of terror and fear in the Americans, because it's fleets that were fighting in the Pacific, because it's one thing to fight against somebody who is rational, but to fight against somebody whose only aim is to kill you is obviously a deeply frightening thing. And the image that you see there on the right is a genuine photograph from the time, albeit rather zoomed in and not of very good quality, but you can literally see a plane there which is only a fraction of a second away from impact. Really quite a terrifying thing. So let's then move on, but before we do so, let's just mention one other thing. How then did the Japanese get people to do this? Well, believe it or not, many people volunteered, or at least were pressured to volunteer, and it was presented in terms of honour, which apparently is a very important concept in Japan. Honour and reputation. And essentially it was presented to these people that if they did not volunteer, then they would live in shame for the remainder of their lives. That was very much part of the motive. So although there were some people who perhaps followed this all the way, many people were forced into it without really having or feeling that they had a genuine choice. So let's begin first of all then with a read through of the poem as usual, and then we'll talk about it. So, Kamikaze. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag waved first one way, then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swiveled toward the sun, and remembering how he and his brothers waiting on the shore built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles to see who withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe, yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till we gradually too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. So, let's begin. So the first thing to note is that there is no contextual link at all between Beatrice Garland and this poem. It is purely a dramatic poem, which is to say it is purely that of an imagined character. So it's a dramatic monologue. She is not Japanese, her father was not a suicide bomber. Now, her father embarked at sunrise. Well, the first thing to note here is the way that in the beginning of this poem, it presents the way that these men were mythologized. And this was deliberate even at the time, because clearly there had to be something that was persuasive and to as a way of getting them to do it at all. So, sunrise. Obviously, sunrise is something that is symbolic of new beginnings and births and so on. Now, of course, that's ironic because this is to be, or is meant to be, this person's last flight and their last mission. So the timing is ironic, but it also, of course, reflects the again, the national myth. Remember, Japan, known as the land of the rising sun. The flag is a rising sun, a red sun rising with rays shooting outwards. And so it's, I suppose, really, it's although it's not a new beginning for the pilots as such, it's meant to represent a kind of new beginning for the country, the rescue of the country. And of course that is the allusion back to the original Kamikaze, the divine wind of the storm that I just mentioned. And then we have this kind of litany of items which he carries with, and in a funny sort of way they almost allude to, they almost sound like grave goods, like the kind of symbolic objects that he might have to take to the afterlife. A flask of water, a samurai sword, a shaven head. Why water? Why the shaven head? Well, it's about purification. It's about being cleansed and ready to enter the afterlife. And of course, the samurai sword is also significant because the samurai were the name given to the Japanese medieval knights. And much like knights in shining armour in our sort of Western European tradition, they were seen as being very honourable and very noble people. So the fact that they were given a samurai sword, again, it's this explicit parallel, symbolically, that you are being told you are a modern day warrior just like that. And though you might not be riding a horse, you might be riding a plane, but the principle is the same. The shaven head, which is full of powerful incantations. So this develops this further then, because in a sense it's this something almost mystical, again, almost magical or spell-like, the way in which men can be or could be seduced in some cases, to fight and to sacrifice themselves in this way. And then finally, enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. Well, again, history links back to the mythologizing, it links back to the whole kamikaze idea, because they were told that they would be making history. They would be joining the kind of great warriors of history. So, in her imaginings, because it tells us at the end that her father never talks about this, therefore this is doubly imagined, as it were. You have a Volta at the start of this second stanza, and it says, "But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats." And we have this idea, then, that she believes in this imagining that at some point on the journey he must have come to his senses and realised that what he was doing was ludicrous. And what she shows causes him to have this change of mind is the sudden vision, as it were, of the beauty of the natural world, of the beauty of what it means to be alive. And we have now this whole series of really idyllic images, and particularly vivid colours more than anything else. So make a note as you go through these next sort of 3 stanzas about the exquisite colours, and to some extent later on the textures as well, the real vividness that represents the joys of being alive. And so he must have looked far down. Notice, by the way, you've got there lines, these little clauses like "she thought," and then on line 3 that phrase "he must have." It kind of emphasises the layers of speculation that we see here. But yes, the little fishing boats, they seem small, diminished, but crucially the scale here is human. We're not talking about these mythic figures, these great warriors. We're talking about human scale. These little fishing boats, it's a reminder about the humility of everyday life. And look at the exquisite simile here, strung out like a bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. Again, note the delightful colour imagery there. And translucent, particularly, this sea is pure. It's a reminder that the real world is innocent. In a sense, he has been perverted by this sort of poisonous mythology that he's been fed. But this is the purity. The purity lies in a simple life in communion with nature. And the reference to bunting, of course, bunting, again, is something that we associate it with sort of happiness or celebration. Again, it's a kind of reminder about all the sorts of things that would be left behind were he to go through with it. And it carries on, and of course this is imagining, because clearly from a plane he can't literally see the fishes. So this is all this sort of imagination. Beneath them, arcing in swathes. Again, that lovely verb arc there, suggesting the graceful movement, the graceful sort of turn of this shoal of fishes. Or the verb phrase as a whole, really, arcing in swathes, and the simile that exemplifies it's like a huge flag waved first one way, then the other. Now, again, we talked at the beginning about the idea of sunrise and the land of the rising sun and the representation of the country, but the fact here that he sees a flag in this, or he imagines a flag in this movement of nature, suggests that that is something that's really worth living for, really worth fighting for, not the poisonous ideology of nationalism that he was being fed at the start of this poem, but to fight for your natural world, your place in it, your home and your heritage. Wave first one way, then the other, in a figure of 8. The dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swivel towards the sun. Again, then another lovely colour there that links back to the green-blue translucent sea, the flashing of silver, the verb and the adjective of the colour there really calls that. And you can link the verb swiveled to arcing, and again the idea of the graceful symbolism. And the fact that it is towards the sun, I suppose again, if we're talking about the fact that it's in the fish, that they're, in the natural world is the real thing to look towards, the fact that these fish are swiveling towards the sun, it's a reminder that the reality, that's what you must embrace, not, as we said, poisonous ideology. And we now move on then to a sort of a proleptic, to a flashback, because she imagines him thinking about his own childhood. And it says, and remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles to see whose withstood the longest. She's talking about a childhood game, a game that I'm sure many of us have played, building these sort of sculptures and things by the sea. And so it's a very nice image of childhood innocence, which once again is juxtaposed to the kind of perverse mysticism at the start of the poem. It's a reminder of what his life looked like when he lived among the idyllic world of fishing that Garland has just described. And what is the peril in that world? Because even the turbulent inrush of breakers, in other words, even the waves on the shore, are only bringing their father's boat safe. In other words, that was a safe world, and that was a secure world that they lived in then, before all this happened. Now we have here this little sort of interjection, this little kind of parenthesis almost, this inserted embedded clause. Yes, grandfather's boat, which again plays to the kind of conversational element here. And I would argue that it perhaps suggests that in terms of the orientation of the audience, in terms of where we are positioned, it implies then perhaps that she is telling this to her own child, and that we are therefore oriented as her own child. Because otherwise, why would you use grandfather? Who knows? It's just a sort of theory. But again, safe to the shore. You've got the double the repetition of safe there at the end of the previous stanza and on the first line of this one, emphasizing that he is, in her imagination, he is looking back to a childhood that was safe. So, safe to the shore, and of course, the safe to the shore, salt-sodden. The sibilance there simply emphasises that fact, the fact that it's a childhood dominated by safety. Awash with cloud-marked mackerel. Again, vivid colour imagery, and particularly that metaphor, the cloud-marked, the idea of the sort of patterning of these fish. Cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns. This is where it starts to get a little bit more tactile, a little bit more touchable, the imagery. But the adjective, of course, they're feathery with that. Loose silver of whitebait. There's a repetition from the silver at the bottom of the third stanza as well. And again, emphasis on these colours, and particularly, I suppose, if we think about it, they're valuable images. Silver is something that is expensive. The clouds that have this idea of beauty. She sees, in her imagination, she sees him seeing the beauty and the real value of the real world. But once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous, and again that rather links to the idea of the turbulent inrush of breakers, the sense that in this idealized world that Garland is depicting of his childhood, this idyllic childhood that he lived, the greatest threat was a large fish. So again, that idyll is contrasted by the strange, perverse, imperialistic, nationalistic world at the start of the poem of pilots being brainwashed into going out to kill themselves and try to kill hundreds of others with it. And now we have the most prolonged italic section, the most prolonged section in the daughter's voice, because it continues, and though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes. because this is the only problem. If a whole country has been poisoned with these kind of ideologies, then to fight against that puts you in a minority. In a culture which places such high value on reputation, then to come back is the ultimate shame, the ultimate loss of face. And so these two images here, the mother who never spoke, nor did she meet his eyes. The implication from the end line of the poem is clear, in the sense that seemingly the mother would have felt more comfortable had the father died. And we realise that this mother is not an isolated figure, but representative of wider views in society, because on the next line it tells us that the neighbours too treated him as though he no longer existed. And we realise, therefore, that actually it's a very strange, topsy-turvy world where a man has made a decision to save lives and is now being shunned for it. It's a poisonous ideology that Garland is talking about. And I suppose, therefore, in that sense, we can link those ideas of tyranny to the poems like Ozymandias, like London, like My Last Duchess, and others, like parts of the Emigre as well. This is a man who is trying to protest, or trying to, as it were, pull back from tyranny, and actually, strangely enough, for us, because of course we assume that to fight tyranny must always be a good thing, it shows that society does not accept it. And we have then, on the final line, only we children still chattered and laughed. Now, if you all recall back to your knowledge of the French philosopher of the 18th century, Rousseau, you will all remember his depiction of childhood as being a time of innocence before society corrupts you. And we see that very clearly referenced here. The children chattered and laughed, and you have those verbs that depict their innocence, youthful carefreeness. But then as they grow older, they too become corrupted by this rather toxic culture, because it says, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned. And so these children too become corrupted by it. That this was no longer the father we loved. In other words, this idea that by choosing to sacrifice his honour, he has forfeited his right to a place in society, in their family, in their hearts. And then this final couplet back out of that voice and back to talking about the pilot, and ends with, and sometimes she said, it's yet another of these kind of sort of spoken language feature reported clauses, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. The implication being, obviously, to die in the suicide flight would be one, but the implication being that he has suffered just as much of a death by living like this. In other words, that to live with shame is the same, or even perhaps worse than death. And that, I think, then is the ending here. Now, in terms of the links to other poems, we've mentioned the tyranny element. You can talk, for example, to some extent about the power of nature in the more sort of positive sense. You can link it to the pastoral images of, for example, things like the beginning of the prelude. You'll see that there, although clearly we're talking about the sea here rather than the land. But a fisherman fishing is not so dissimilar in metaphorical terms to a shepherd looking after his flock. It's very much that same principle. So, what else then is worth mentioning? Structure-wise, it's written in these sestet stanzas, although frankly there's not a great deal that you can say about that. In free verse, there's no with irregular meter. So again, it links to the idea of the sort of naturalism of it, the sort of rather conversational quality that it's meant to have. And I think more or less that concludes it. We've mentioned actually, I feel what is worth mentioning. There's a kind of we talk about the way that the Kamikaze pilot's childhood is presented in rather idealized terms. That compares to the line about the children chattering and laughing. But so in other words, it compares to that, but then contrasts to their experience as they grow older. So there's perhaps, if we want to view this poem in a particularly negative light, we can argue that it is suggesting then that growing up inevitably leads to the poisoning of ideals, because these children grow up and become victims of it in just the same way that he did. In that regard, then perhaps it's a very pessimistic poem about the potential and possibilities of human life to flourish. In that sense, I suppose perhaps it contrasts somewhat to things like Storm on the Island, which seems more optimistic. Worth mentioning there. So, as usual, please make sure that your notes have the following subheadings: the topic or subject of the poem and a plot if applicable, notes on form and structure. So for this poem, you'll need things like reference to the voices. You'll want reference to things like flashbacks or the kind of the sort of spatial shifts where appropriate, and that's probably the main thing there. Obviously the annotated copy of the poem, which hopefully you've just done, and then on the next slide please make sure that you complete your clusters in as much detail as possible. So as usual, make sure that they're fully detailed, like the partial example that I've done for you below. So the speaker, i.e. the pilot's daughter, initially mythologizes the pilot, or rather she depicts the way that society has indoctrinated him through mythology, perhaps would be a better way to express that. And she has quotations like, "It embarks at sunrise, the allusion to the land of the rising sun, that symbol of the country's supposed new dawn," which is in itself subverted, because for this pilot it is to lead to his death, but that subversion is kind of inadvertent. And then you've got the flask of water, the samurai sword, the shaven head, the powerful incantations, the asyndetic list there. Now I would argue that that list of items is in itself rather like an incantation. It's like a spell, a list of ingredients. There's something quite powerful about that. And linking to that, the idea of the one-way journey into history, because again it's this explicit and self-conscious identification with the glories of the country's history, like the name Kamikaze itself. That is what is being used or abused in order to create this whole idea. So that's the insubstantial mysticism. The next point then is the exquisite beauty of the real natural world, which is juxtaposed to that. Then finally, she imagines him remembering his own childhood as a more innocent time, and lastly, she remembers his part in her own childhood as an object of shame. So if you can please fill in those clusters in full detail once again, including quotations, including terms, including the key points. Thank you very much indeed. On that note, we will conclude this video, and I believe that means that there is only one more to do. Thank you very much indeed. We are nearly there.